Hello and welcome to the February 28th edition of Ukraine Without Hype. I am Anthony Bardaway. Now, in our last episode, I gave my whole spiel about wanting to get back onto schedule, and that immediately did not happen. Unfortunately, this time around, I got a pretty terrible cold, which meant that this is the first day that I could actually speak for longer than 10 minutes at a time. And in fact, we'll be breaking up this recording so my voice can survive it. Until that point, I'll be having an incredible amount of drugs, a very large pot of tea, and sit right next to a humidifier. So let's get this going. So this episode will be a news roundup. And while I did not exactly intend for it to happen this way, it turns out that many of today's topics will have to do with technology, sanctions evasion, and the various ways that Russia has both suffered from sanctions as well as finding ways to work anyway, often with the protection of American businesses as well as others, but I really have to shake some fingers at the Americans right at this episode. But in addition to that, we'll be talking about the changes in the government that occurred since the beginning of the year, as well as the changing international situation, focusing largely on Venezuela and Iran and what that means specifically for Ukraine, a topic which we have described in other forms, but can use some catching up on. Though, of course, we do have to acknowledge before any of that this last week or 2 weeks has been a series of anniversaries of extremely important dates. February 20th was the Day of the Heroes of the Heavenly Hundred. In 2014, after several months of protests in central Kiev as well as other parts of the country that are sometimes ignored in favor of the primary protest that was happening in Kiev, but Maidan was happening all over the country, not only in Kiev. This was at the very terminal phase of the revolution, when Viktor Yanukovych ordered the shootings of protesters. Now, the Euromaidan revolution at that point had been violent. There had been beatings. Officers had even gone to hospitals to follow up on people they had already beaten in order to beat them even more. But in the last phase here, in February 20th, which is the day we remember, it happened over the course of several days, is when government allied snipers opened fire on the protesters, killing over 100 people. This was the breaking point. At this point, there was a lot of debate over whether the protesters should accept a deal with the government to wait for the next elections to happen. There was tensions between the political leadership that kind of claimed ownership of the protests, even though they were not actually leading anything themselves, and the actual people doing the hard work of freedom. But this massacre kind of put an end to that debate, forcing the issue, leading to Yanukovych being driven out of the country. Though before he did that, he took a stopover in Crimea and very likely was involved in the Russian invasion of the peninsula, and was impeached by Parliament. He had abandoned his post, and because he had vacated his position, Parliament had a vote to get rid of him entirely. This capped off on February 23rd, when the revolution fully succeeded. Though before that date even passed, the Russians had begun their invasion of Crimea. Russian forces had both prepared in their own base in Sevastopol, as well as a team that had left Russia for Crimea in order to take over the civilian government of Crimea and began running things themselves. So the joy of the revolution was definitely tempered by the beginning of the Russian invasion, which would bloom in new and tragic ways over the next weeks and months. And of course, February 24th was the anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion, when Vladimir Putin, after almost a whole year of preparations, gave his speech declaring the beginning of the quote-unquote special military operation. I have given my story on this podcast of where I was on that day before, but I just made a short video on it for New Voice of Ukraine. Head over to NVUA or patreon.com/NVUA in order to see yet another description of how things kind of went down. But I do definitely have an idea of my mind of a project covering the lead up to the invasion, beginning with the failed revolution in Belarus, which is when I really see the preparations as really taking shape up through that day of the 24th. So that is another nearby anniversary. all that actually nestled within Pancake Week this week. Pancake Week, the holiday that precedes Lent, where you eat a bunch of pancakes made with butter. I did not do that this year because I was far too sick to actually go to the places I traditionally do that. Unfortunately, typically what I do for Pancake Week is I go to the Folk Architecture Museum. It's a bunch of 19th century buildings taken and put together. It's real cool. I usually go there, stuff my face full of pancakes to usher in the end of winter, but I was far, far too sick for that this year. So that could have been a way to cut through the tension of all the remembrances of this past week that are otherwise pretty heavy. And happy beginning of Ramadan, as we were talking about holiday observances. So that's the prelude to this episode. I just talking about what's going on in Kyiv recently, and again, super heavy atmosphere because of that. Looking into the 5th year of war now, passing by that 4th year anniversary into our 5th year of hell and death and destruction and horrificness and trauma that shows no sign of coming to an end anytime soon. So with that, if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype, or you can go to our primary employer, New Voice of Ukraine, english.nv.ua, for daily news, and go to patreon.com/NVUA to support Ukrainian independent media. So on to the episode, and there's an interesting twist on what would be the battlefield update this week, and that is Russia losing access, either of their own accord or through outside forces, of losing access to a lot of their technological backbone. And the first of this has to do with Starlink. Starlink is a very complicated topic in Ukraine. Starlink is the satellite internet service provided by SpaceX, the company owned by Elon Musk, and everyone is of very complicated feelings about it. One, Elon Musk has been quite hostile to Ukraine. The reliance on Starlink in Ukraine has allowed Elon Musk in order to interfere on several circumstances when it comes to actual war planning. There have been numerous episodes about this. I'm sure we covered it on some of our episodes. I mean that in the historical way we're talking about historical events episodes. There have been numerous instances where this became an issue, including an attempted attack on occupied Crimea, where the Ukrainians assumed that they would have Starlink coverage, and when they went to confirm this with Elon Musk, this was denied. Now, there are ways in which he talks about this that don't seem realistic. The way he said it, that was essentially there were Ukrainian attack drones on their way to Crimea, and he saw this attack was about to happen, relying on his own Starlink services, and because of that, he did not want to be involved in war and made the decision personally not to allow this access to happen, leading to these Ukrainian drones losing contact with their controllers and washing ashore on Crimea. This doesn't necessarily seem to be how it actually happened, which is curious because the way he described it makes him more implicated in a disaster than he would have been otherwise. His version that makes him seem much more individually culpable is much worse for him, really, but that seems to not be true. It was simply the fact that Starlink did not have access to Crimea at the time, and he chose not to extend access to Crimea. The idea of him actually sitting there in the situation room, his own personal situation room, trying to individually manipulate the flow of the war does not seem realistic, but it's the image that he tried to project onto the world. And since then, there hasn't been many instances. There have been some cases of Starlink shutting down at inopportune times, inopportune places. There have been lots of debate over the Russians gaining access to their own Starlink systems, their own physical satellite receivers that they're able to purchase illegally in the United States or somewhere else, bringing them into Russia and being able to use them on Ukrainian territory. And a lot of these complaints really focused on the idea that, I could shut down Starlink access to the Russians, but then everyone in the area would not have access to it. Then the Ukrainians wouldn't have access to it. So there's no real way to gate out the Russians because it's all seemingly location-based rather than anything more specific. Well, that all turned out to be wrong. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense was able to figure something out with Starlink that made it so that the only way you could gain access to satellite internet through their Starlinks is by registering an individual unit as being associated with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And I have to say the bad version of this first, just because I hate Elon Musk so much. If this is true, and it was always possible to shut out access to the Russians while leaving access to the Ukrainians intact, why is this only happening now? Starlinks were absolutely vital to the Russian war effort, and still are, leading to the problems I'm about to get into. The access to Starlink satellite internet is what allowed for a lot of the more complicated maneuvers that the Russians were able to undergo, that they're able to have access to the internet in these very remote locations without having to rely on Ukrainian internet, allowed for their small unit tactics to actually work, for their largely disconnected system of forward operating bases would allow them to have communications, to work through their drones. Both surveillance and attack relied, in many cases, on these Starlinks. If Russia never had access to these Starlinks to begin with, their war effort would have been severely hampered, especially compared to the capabilities of Ukraine of having this internet, and a lot more people would be alive right now. So yes, it's fantastic that the Russians were finally being able to be shut out of Starlink, but it's been 4 years, and the Russians have been using the Starlink for a lot of that and have been using it to great effect. I don't believe for a second that this technical capability was only accessible now and not before now. So it just doesn't make sense unless some other kind of deal was cut. And I'm concerned of what Musk demanded in exchange for this. Okay, so that is my expression of anger for why this didn't happen sooner. But what's happening now? Now, in my last episode, I went into extensive detail about the way the Russians fight, so we can just skip over that for now. But a summary of it, which will come into great importance now, is that the Russians have been able to move a bit beyond trench warfare. And now what it is that how they will operate is to send small groups of people into a territory. They will take up positions in basements, in barns, in irrigation ditches, and in many cases just stay put until enough of those barns and cellars and irrigation ditches are also full of Russians. While Ukraine tries to do the same thing, leading to, instead of a front line, rather a kill zone, where if you are in this 10-kilometer, 20-kilometer wide area, there may be a Russian or Ukrainian position at any point in there, leading to a very large, very porous mesh of positions rather than static lines. And the way that this is able to work as well as it does is that soldiers have access to rather advanced telecommunications. Much of this includes Starlink, though not every individual Russian soldier is lugging around a Starlink satellite, but many of these forward operating positions are able to have it in one way, as do the Ukrainians. And because the Russians are able to have this rather extensive telecommunications network, reliable telecommunications network, they're able to operate in these small unit autonomous way. Officers behind the lines are basically able to control soldiers by having surveillance drones follow them around and tell them where to go in pretty close to real time. But now they don't have Starlink, which means a lot of those communications networks have broken down, or not as much broken down so much as we had much more friction in them, because they have to find other ways to do this through antenna, through Wi-Fi meshes. In some cases, they are running physical phone lines from World War II era, leading, by the way, to a massive amount of increase in the demand for copper wiring in Russia right now, in order to meet the demands for everyone suddenly requiring actual wired field telephones. Setting up antennae also means that Russian soldiers are much more vulnerable. They have to climb something to set up a physical bit of infrastructure in order to have access to the internet. And as they do that, they are exposed and are able to be killed. So Russia is able to find these workarounds to get alternatives to Starlink, but they're far less efficient. They require people to put themselves in danger and generally creates more time, more points of communication breakdown between a commander and a soldier, which led to the battlefield update I'm about to share. Now, some people have been framing this entirely around the situation of Starlink being shut down and the problems that I just rose. Though this counteroffensive that's currently taking place in primarily the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions has been a long time in the planning, and in fact began several days before Starlink was even shut down. So it's not entirely based on Starlink, though it's certainly helped. So because Russian lines are so extended outwards, so, like I said, porous, and so much of this is gray zone, what Ukraine decided to do was to have these smaller counteroffensives within the gray zone to push out a lot of these small positions, these forward positions, these basements and barns and irrigation ditches that have Russians and push against them. This has led to a lot of success. And it leads to another question of how maps work, because what's the maps may be showing right now is Ukraine being able to take back a lot of territory. That's not exactly the case. What's happening in Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions is not so much pushing into Russian-controlled territory as much as it is taking this gray zone and turning it a lighter shade of gray, clearing out a lot of the Russian positions within this, like I said, 20-kilometer wide gray zone, getting rid of the Russians there and creating more breathing room. And it has been quite successful. A lot of positions have been recovered, towns have been retaken, and a lot of this progress that Russia had been able to make in the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions has been reversed. And certainly a lot of that had to do, no matter what the government may be saying, with the fact that these positions lost access to their telecommunications. They were no longer able to coordinate their defense and attack against the Ukrainians, and because of that were able to be repulsed. And again, why couldn't this have happened sooner? This is not, again, a massive counteroffensive that has seized a bunch of territory and liberated towns from the Russian yoke. Again, it's just doing a essentially extremely large clearance operation in areas that Ukraine was able to kind of get to before anyway, but in a much more dangerous way. And I think the way of saying creating breathing room is the best way to say it. Taking gray zone and making it safe. And it's hard to get too specific of where that would may be, because of course we rely on maps, and my whole point of this whole description here is to say that the maps are not exactly reliable and that the areas that are being taken were not so much Russian controlled so much as Russian presence. But it does make me feel a lot better about certainly Zaporizhzhia. Last episode I gave my very long description of why I'm so concerned about Zaporizhzhia. If the Russians are able to inch closer to it, then eventually it could be a human safari there. And these counteroffensives have cut out a lot of the Russian advance towards Zaporizhzhia. So that at least delays that battle. It makes the cost of Russia reaching the point of even having that battle much higher. And is the case with any counteroffensives, it is an issue of morale. It is Ukraine gaining on the battlefield. And it is the Russians watching the fact that they worked so hard for these positions, these forward positions, only for it to be all wiped out within the course of about 2 weeks. That will have morale effects on the Russians. 12 people died for that irrigation ditch, and now that battle has been reversed. But there's another element to this as well, and that's another tool that the Russians had been using that it's unclear of how much access to it they will be having in the future, and that's Telegram. Now in America, Telegram is mostly used to buy drugs or do racism, but within Ukraine, as well as Russia and much of the former Soviet Union, which is one of those words that I always have to problematize. Of course, there's more to these countries than just saying the former Soviet Union, but one thing they do have in common is use of Telegram. In Ukraine, in Russia, in Kazakhstan, in a lot of these countries, people really like to use Telegram. It is initially a Russian-built texting and messaging service built by Pavel Durov, a very famous Russian IT guy that is against the government but has a lot of questionable ties to the Russian intelligence services. I certainly use Telegram more than anything else, but the knowledge that it is designed by this guy with Russian connections like that, Russian security connections, I should say, is not as exactly comfortable, but it is what everyone uses, unless you need to get a bit more security than people use Signal as well. But Telegram isn't just for sending silly memes to each other, it's also a news service. A lot of the Russian mill bloggers have their audience through Telegram. I get a lot of my Ukraine news through Telegram. I get told the specifics of when a missile or a drone is coming in through Telegram. It is the primary source of information for people in both Ukraine and in Russia. However, the Russian government has recently made the decision to block Telegram. There's been a lot of speculation of what they may be, of if the Russian government is concerned about all these independent news sites that use Telegram as their main distribution network. That means that by shutting down Telegram, they can shut down the spread of bad news and shut down the ability of not only liberal, but also ultra-nationalist frustrations with the government. And by cutting off Telegram, they avoid those problems altogether. That's part of it, certainly. Russia does not like the idea of independent services that people can have amounts of anonymity in that have these information distribution networks. But the exact reason they gave is that it was a security risk. Sure. So they tried to ban Telegram, and that immediately raises some problems. Like I said, a lot of Russians get their news about it. That also means that Russians do a lot of fundraising on Telegram for the army, and a lot of Russian military units use Telegram as one of their primary forms of communication with each other. Ukrainians do as well. A lot of Ukrainian military units will communicate not only within the unit, but also with nearby units using Telegram channels or Signal, but including Telegram. But certainly Russians do this, and that by losing Telegram, that made their communications harder. Now, the Russian military has released its own alternative to Telegram, and at the moment the Russian government is really trying to push out its own texting service. It's called Max. A lot of Russian phones are being automatically updated with Max. It's a messenger and e-commerce app, just came out last year. It's supposed to basically be a copy of Chinese WeChat, but it is 100% just it's spyware. It's Russian government spyware. If someone has Max on their phone, the Russian government's able to track them. And apparently the Russian military doesn't like using it so much because they're all still on Telegram. And this has been the problem with a lot of apps. The Russian government has designed mapping apps and a bunch of stuff that Russians don't use, instead using commercially available options. Now, I'd actually like to turn you to an episode of The Eastern Border. Christoph Anderson's friend of the show has worked with me on some projects here in Ukraine, and he did a pretty big episode about all these apps that the Russians use. So rather than trying to copy what he did, he knows much more about IT than I do. I'll just point you to go to the podcast, The Eastern Border, and listen to his episode about that, about all these apps that the Russian military uses, about how Russia has tried to get everyone onto their own in-house apps, how that just didn't work because they're terrible and they don't work as well as commercially available ones. But to get back to Telegram, and the effect of that was similar to the effect of shutting down Starlink, which it created more friction. Now, Starlink has other options for satellite internet, Wi-Fi, even using Ukrainian SIM cards, though by using the Ukrainian SIM card and gaining access to Ukrainian data networks, that is a huge exposure of them. Ukraine figured out how to get into SIM cards a long time ago. But what this does, again, between Starlink being shut down and being forced off of Telegram, is that it means that Russians have to figure stuff out, which means more time is taken, more effort is taken. It's not necessarily as immediately intuitive. And each of these things create more friction in the system, makes things longer to do. And by extending these decision chains, they're able to do less things. They're able to carry out fewer attacks, and they're able to share less information about the attacks that they are under. Friction in the system is good for Ukraine, I should say, makes the Russians less efficient. Now, Telegram apparently was switched back on, to my understanding. The Russian military quickly figured out that they can't just turn off the main source of communications that their military was using. And so they have tried to keep Telegram turned on in the occupied territories, at least. They're trying to make it so you can access Telegram if you are in occupied Kherson region, but not in Russia itself. And overall, it leads to a lot of disarray within the Russian armed forces. They'll figure it out. They have already begun to figure it out in some ways, but every inconvenience for them helps. So yes, in summary, Russia shut out of Starlink and shuts itself out of Telegram, creating a lot of problems for the telecommunications of the Russian army, and Ukraine is able to take advantage of that failures of communications on the side of the Russians in order to carry out this counteroffensive that seals up a lot of the gray zone, drives Russians out of a lot of forward operating positions, and generally gives Ukraine more breathing room. In our next section, I'll be talking about the changes in the government that have happened this year, and it does very much connect to the Starlink issue as well. So at the beginning of the year, Ukraine was left with a question. The number 2 guy, Ukrainian government, Andriy Yermak, the chief of staff for the presidential office, had resigned under the shadow of a massive corruption scandal. Yermak was the day-to-day guy of the Ukrainian government in many ways. He was in charge of a lot of staffing. He handled a lot of military decisions, it turned out. Unfortunately, he's not so great at that. He handled a lot of diplomacy. And while generally President Zelensky was the big picture guy, he handed off responsibilities to Andriy Yermak to take care of the nitty-gritty details, the day-to-day. And then he was gone. This extraordinarily powerful person within the Ukrainian government gone, again in the wake of this corruption scandal. Although he has not yet been actually implicated, we can assume that by stepping down, that was part of a deal to kind of cut off that investigation before it had to go too deep into him. Kind of a preliminary plea deal, so to speak, where he was going to be forced to resign anyway, so just step aside and let the investigation continue. But it raised the question of who would replace him. This is, as I said, an extremely powerful position within the Ukrainian government. Ukraine is a strong presidential system, and so the person in charge of the presidential office is not quite vice president, but the closest thing to it in the current system. Under many presidents, this was a very powerful and influential position. So you would think that people would want it, but not really. There were some qualifiers as to what would make someone good at this job, and the first of which is reliability. Andriy Yermak had the position for as long as he did because he was reliable. He was loyal. He did what he was told to do and protected Zelensky's back. Who else could take that job? Other politicians had their own interests and would not necessarily put the interests of Zelensky first. And there's also the simple fact that the presidential office is facing a lot of crises, and we've talked about these crises so many times. But what that means is whoever is in charge of the presidential office right now, they're going to catch a lot of problems. Problems on the battlefield, problems with this corruption investigation, problems with dealing with the Americans, and any setbacks that occur will come down to the reputation of the presidential chief of staff. Things will happen that are bad, and whoever's sitting in that chair will have to take responsibility for it. It's almost a sacrificial position in a way. And if there happens to be a disadvantageous peace deal that is forced on Ukraine, the two people who will take the most blame for it will be Zelensky and whoever is his chief of staff. And also, just technically, it's a difficult position. It requires a ton of organizational skill that is not always available in everybody. And so for a while, people are really avoiding wanting to be the chief of staff. Nobody is really clamoring for it. But here comes a rather strong choice for the position of head of the presidential administration. That's Kirill Budanov. Kirill Budanov, we had a whole episode about him as the head of Ukrainian military intelligence. Hard as nails, man. He personally took part in a raid in Crimea during I always call it the Donbass phase of the war, prior to 2022, between 2014 and 2022, where he did this raid on Crimea, got injured, and that's why he doesn't walk so good at the moment. Impeccable reputation, one of the most trusted people in the country, and importantly, the most American connected man in the country, probably. We went over this and we talked specifically about military intelligence, but basically what happened is that in the wake of Euromaidan revolution, the Americans come in, they see the SBU, the much larger intelligence service, and don't really trust it because it is so thoroughly infested with Russian agents and with a lot of corruption because of the fact that it handles economic crimes, lots of opportunities to be corrupt. And so they were cautious about working with the SBU at first and instead turned towards military intelligence. Much smaller, needed to be pretty much built up entirely, and no real systemic issues with corruption, though there's always corruption somewhere. In this case, it was seen as being very clean. And Budanov was the man that the Americans worked with to rebuild Ukrainian intelligence capacity, but also he's the one who impressed on the Americans how effective Ukrainian intelligence offices can be. Very trusted in Ukraine, very trusted in America, at least in the security services. So yes, they chose someone who does have extraordinary organizational capabilities. They chose somebody who had his own reputation, but also, and this is where I think it's really interesting, is that it was somewhat assumed that Budanov would have his own political goals at some point in the future. Not now, but at some point in the future, he would want to leverage his extraordinary popularity and reputation as someone who's reliable and loyal to have his own political career, much like Valery Zaluzhny, the former commander-in-chief of the armed forces, who is looked at as a future political leader. And it's this political angle, to me, that raises a lot of questions, because obviously he is one of the best in the country to have the job, but why? Like I said, by attaching himself to this position, he runs the risk of severely damaging his reputation. If he is in charge with negotiations, if he is supposed to be the one who is getting the Americans in line, if the Americans do something that they've often done, working with Russia, putting pressure on Ukraine to accept a bad peace deal, etc., that would then be looped in on Budanov, and suddenly his reputation is not so good anymore. However, it also allows him to build up his own political networks. He is now a politician. He is now a go-between between the various branches of the executive, of the legislature. He is now the fulcrum on which the Ukrainian political system rests. And in that way, he can build up his own political connections for a future career. But risk-reward, a career that can be shadowed by the fact that he is in charge of this office that could put him responsible for negative things. So that's the calculation that he's making. So what's the calculation that Zelensky is making? And if you look at most polling, the opposition to Zelensky, made up of actual politicians who hold civilian office and have run for office before, is not so encouraging for them. I don't think Poroshenko could win an election against Zelensky. Timoshenko certainly not. Budanov could, though. Zaluzhny could, though. They both poll very well, even though they have never announced that they're running for anything. People know their names and like them, and so top a lot of the polling. By putting Budanov in charge of this presidential administration, he is tied entirely to the political fate of Volodymyr Zelensky. Where he falls, Budanov falls. Where Budanov rises, Zelensky rises. Zelensky no longer has that potential political rival. Meanwhile, the other option there, Zaluzhny, his name is not just going up against Zelensky's, but now Budanov's. So Zelensky is able to bring in this popular figure, kind of eliminates him as a rival because they are so tied together, while also kind of containing the popularity of the potential political rival in Zaluzhny, because Budanov is almost as good. And really, I see this as Zelensky pretty effectively working his way out of a massive political crisis. He has lost a lot of popularity, but the only way for that to matter is to have an opposition that can actually stand up to him. And I gave a much longer description of this in the last episode, so again, defer to that one. And no one's really strong enough to stand up to him. Poroshenko's not, Timoshenko's not. The only people who can are Budanov and Zaluzhny. Budanov is now on side, and Zaluzhny is now competing with not only Zelensky, but also Budanov at the same time. So as a simple act of political maneuver, effective, very effective. We'll see how it handles future crises, but thus far, brilliant. But who replaced Budanov? He was in a very important position. He was in charge of military intelligence, war hero, in charge of all these remarkable operations that made him as famous and popular as he is. So who's replacing him? And his replacement is Ola Evashenko, who is himself a pretty accomplished intelligence agent. His most recent job is he was head of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. Now, this is the probably less storied intelligence service in Ukraine, but it is quite effective. It's the closest thing to like a CIA, I'll call it, but because of overlapping responsibilities, didn't quite gain as much prestige as HUR or the SBU. But he had plenty of experience within military intelligence. He is the former first deputy head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. So he was already a high up within military intelligence beforehand, before getting kind of promoted to a job that he was able to be promoted to. The only way up from the first deputy head of the main intelligence directorate would be the head of the main intelligence directorate, a job held by Budanov. So without Budanov being pushed aside, there was no way to rise to that position, and was instead promoted to the head of a separate intelligence agency. But now that the more prestigious intelligence agency has its job opening, he took it. It's a completely logical promotion here. While I could not find too much about his career specifically, he was very close to Budanov throughout this whole time, and yeah, very, very logical for that. But there are other turnarounds within the intelligence community that does get more complicated. Now, I also did another episode on Vasil Melyuk, the head of the SBU, the Security Services of Ukraine. And he was another scary guy. Again, did a whole episode about him. Go back and listen to it for more details. But he was a very effective head of the SBU. To me, I think one of his most important accomplishments is that he was able to turn the SBU from a very heavily infiltrated by Russia intelligence agency to one that is able to carry out operations without the Russians ever hearing about them, which is, the number one task that you would have as an intelligence officer in Ukraine. But it was no light task. The SBU and Russian intelligence before 2014 were very tightly bound together, and that continued after 2014. And Russia were at war with each other, albeit in a much smaller scale war than the one that we're having now. The SBU was not super reliable. They were the godfathers of the children in the Russian intelligence. They were used to vacationing together. There's a lot of infiltration, and infiltration goes both ways. Ukrainians have a lot of ears in Russian intelligence as well. Melyuk was able to shut down a lot of those leaks, and that was super important, very effective. However, politics got to him, and I'll admit that this is one area that I was speculating on in a way that was kind of wrong. I was under the assumption that Melyuk had a feud with the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, that a lot of the problems with NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, were being handled through the SBU, and that we were seeing a bit of an intergovernmental rivalry between NABU and the SBU. I was under the assumption that Melyuk himself was making a lot of the calls against NABU, and that may partially be the case, but turns out not nearly enough as what was expected from them from the presidential administration. It turned out a lot of what was going on behind the scenes was that Melyuk wasn't feuding with NABU, that NABU was going after members of the presidential administration, and it was expected that the SBU would act against them, in some cases did, and that's what left me the impression that there was this feud. But no, Melyuk was apparently refusing to support raids on NABU, that the presidential administration was expecting Melyuk to go after NABU, and he wasn't to the extent that he wanted to be. And so, because he was not protecting the presidential administration, he gets fired. If he was not able to protect Yermak, and the presidential administration thought it was his job to protect Yermak, and Yermak got caught anyway and got the boot and lost his job, that falls on Melyuk for not protecting him. Now, from the point of view of clean government, You don't want the FBI to be protecting corruption. You want the FBI to be attacking corruption, which is not happening in America right now. And so there shouldn't be blowback when Malyuk did his job correctly, but there was. So Yermak loses his job. Malyuk loses his as well. Now, this isn't a full demotion. Apparently, Malyuk is being put in charge of clandestine activities at the SBU. He is getting a demotion to be doing the thing that he liked to do anyway. So he's certainly not out of office or anything like that. He will be organizing attacks on Russia. He will be organizing attacks such as Operation Spiderweb, which he was in charge of last summer. That kind of thing is still under his purview, but as a deputy manager, not the main guy in charge. So, Malyuk, I judged you wrong. I thought you were doing more corruption than you were. And in the end, it was your integrity that eventually brought you down. I judged you wrong, and my apologies. But who's replacing him? So the new head of the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, is Yevgeny Kamara. His most recent job was that he was in charge of reorganizing the Center for Special Operations, the Alpha Unit. The Alpha Unit within the SBU is one of the most elite high-level units within the Ukrainian military/security services. It's the Security Service of Ukraine is not part of the Ministry of Defense, so it's not technically military, but it's very high-end special forces controlled by the SBU, has carried out many very sensitive and difficult operations. They are some of the best, and he was in charge of some of the reforms within Alpha and headed Alpha himself as well. So Malyuk isn't exactly being replaced with someone opposite to him or hostile to him. Kamara has been seemingly a protege of Malyuk, being able to be in charge of this extremely sensitive position. Malyuk put him in charge of his baby. So it's not like the knives are out for Malyuk or anything like that. And I, much like with military intelligence, this guy, obvious choice to head the SBU, was in charge of this very important unit, had experience with the kind of organizational side of things. Great. I'm not sad that he's in charge, certainly. I'm a bit sad of Malyuk losing his job. He's replaced with someone who's also good and puts the same emphasis on the SBU as Malyuk did, which again is these elite clandestine operations. These very sensitive, demanding, super secretive attacks on Russia, if any comes from the same kind of background, which means the same kind of focus. Politics are, unfortunately, politics. But the other person that is very important within this government shakeup is the replacement of the Minister of Defense. There were questions about Umerov's involvement within the corruption scheme, and just a quick update on that corruption scheme. Plug that in here because I don't want to dwell on it too much. Our Energy Minister Man Hiroshenko has been arrested. So this corruption case I've been referring to time and time again, there has been another arrest in that of Hiroshenko. But the Minister of Defense, Umerov, has a bit of stink on his name, and so was replaced as defense minister by Fedorov. Mikhailo Fedorov, his most recent job before this, he was the deputy prime minister and minister of digital transformations. He is the country's top tech bro. And I say that with all the love that that word can carry. He was a phenomenally successful businessman within the IT sphere, which in Ukraine is the least corrupt part of the economy. If you are in charge of, resource extraction, these old Soviet factories, there's a lot of problems within those sectors as it comes to the echoes of the 90s, we can say. But the modern sectors of the economy, IT, that kind of thing, there's not much room for corruption in those, which means that the people involved in those industries are seen as much cleaner. And Fedorov was really one of the most successful of them. And as a part of his government ties, he was responsible for creating Dia, which is the app that is used for everything in Ukraine. If you need to file government paperwork, you can do it over this app. You can have your passport, your COVID tests, all that in one spot on this app, Dia app. Massively important in Ukraine. His team His companies were responsible for that. He played a major role in the digitalization of the Ukrainian government. And at this point, Ukraine is one of the most digitized governments in the world. Took a lot of influence from Estonia in that way, but the efficiency, the reliability of government e-resources in Ukraine are very, very high quality and far more, frankly, than the United States or even most of continental Europe are stone ages compared to what's available in Ukraine. And Fedorov is responsible for a lot of that. And when these programs are online, that means they're cleaner. There's less room for greasing people's palms. There's less room for, bribes and that kind of thing when everything is nice and transparent and freely available. Super important set of reforms that Fedorov helped take part in. United 24, army of drones. Quite frankly, if you, as a foreigner, see something from Ukraine that involves the internet in some way, Fedorov's probably involved. And he had been in charge of promoting drone programs in general. But now, as Minister of Defense, that's a way of saying that Ukrainian defense development, that Ukrainian focus on anything military will be focused on technology, on drones, on high-tech development, and business development as well, promoting the development of these high-tech industries in Ukraine for the war effort. But I do have my reservations as well. He is still a tech bro, which means that he has some proclivities that I do not enjoy. One of them is that he has been working very closely with Palantir for the development of AI-driven drone technologies. Palantir is the company of Peter Thiel and is one of the first in the world when it comes to, government surveillance. Now, you may think that the main problem here is by working with Palantir that there will be some expansion of government surveillance of Ukraine. That's not what I'm talking about here. The problem is that Palantir, as a company that is attached to some unsavory figures within the United States, I just don't see it as reliable. Going back to the discussion about Starlink, there were problems with Starlink, and a lot of those problems can be seen as political in nature. By connecting Ukrainian drone development and specifically the development of autonomous drones, by tying that into Palantir, who's to say that these techno-fascists that control this company will not try to undermine Ukraine? Maybe let's turn it off one day. I don't know what's technically part of this. No, there are some reasons why they wouldn't. There's some very good business reasons why Palantir would be involved in Ukraine. They can't exactly work with Russia very well, which means that if they want to get data on how drone warfare works, you got to work with the Ukrainians. And of course, they're getting paid for the services as well. But the data is astronomically important to tech companies right now. Where else in the world is there the sheer quantity of data being generated about how drone warfare works that is, again, as economically accessible? Palantir helps Ukraine develop this weaponry. In exchange, they get the data they need to be a defense company. It's access that not many have and will put them ahead of their competitors by quite a lot by the politics of it. Peter Thiel and his little minions, they can make some decisions that I don't want them to make. But that said, as the Silicon Valley whisperer in Ukraine, Fedorov did negotiate this deal with Musk to disable the Russian use of Starlinks. It is very possible that maybe Musk just likes him. Musk is a temperamental person just like Trump. Get him someone who can flatter him, makes him feel nice. Maybe that's all you need. Maybe they just needed someone who could speak Musk's language to him, butter him up about the importance of Starlink and how he's building the future, and whatever industry babble that tech pros like to hear. Fedorov was well prepared for that kind of thing. Maybe Musk just liked him. The question of why did Musk not shut down Starlink to Russians before? Maybe just wasn't asked for it in the right way before. And it took someone who understands tech bro speak in order to get that concession. For better and for worse, we have a Silicon Valley guy in charge now, and hopefully he can work that to his advantage, which seems to be the case that he already has. But to close off this section about the internal politicking of Ukraine, which I actually do see as Ukraine Without Hype's bread and butter. This is how we started as the political inside baseball type news outlet for Ukraine. So it's always fun to talk about this kind of thing. Is that Zaluzhny, former commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, put out an article, gave some details as to the strained relationship between himself and President Zelensky. It had long been known that Zaluzhny and Zelensky clashed very often over military strategy while Zaluzhny was the commander-in-chief. These tensions over strategy include the time even before the full-scale invasion, when Bankova was not really treating the threat of invasion as seriously as many in Ukraine were wanting them to, and so Zaluzhny kind of did some war preparations on his own in a way that was semi-illegal, and he could have gotten in trouble for if the war didn't actually come. Moving soldiers around without the full cooperation of the civilian government, it's not the kind of thing people like. Although it was although it was the correct decision, obviously. But the most important part of their disagreements came down to the 2023 counteroffensive. This was on the heels of the successes in the Kherson and Kharkiv regions. Now, as Zaluzhny says it, and I'm going to problematize this in a second, what Zaluzhny wanted to do was to create a singular, powerful fist that could punch through Russian defenses within the Zaporizhzhia region, but because of other priorities, because of other decisions that were made by the government, he did not have the resources that he needed to have in order to carry out that counteroffensive. And that it was Zelensky's decision to deny him those resources. And that's kind of the crux of this main dispute between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. But I don't fully buy this idea. There were many other factors involved in that. It wasn't really Zelensky denying the resources. In many cases, it was the Americans and Europeans who were very slow in providing the resources that would have been needed for the counteroffensive. There needed to be tanks. Well, the West didn't send that many tanks, and it took a long time for those tanks to be delivered. By the time that those resources were rallied together, several months had passed. Russia had built up considerable defenses within the Zaporizhzhia direction. And what I think was most controversially that was not included in this statement was the fact that new equipment was sent to newly made units of people who had recently been recruited rather than veterans. All the veterans were in Donbass at the time. And so the units that took part in this counteroffensive were very green. So having those inexperienced units with equipment that took a very long time to get to them, I don't think that more resources in that 2023 counteroffensive would have been enough, especially by at that point, what they really needed was air power and air superiority, which did not come and has not yet come, and probably will never come. So the criticisms that Zaluzhny made towards Zelensky are certainly accurate, but they left out a lot, and he left out a lot that he himself certainly would have been aware of, which means he was selective here. He was selective towards the things that Zelensky may have had more influence over, and taking the decisions off of himself. And again, this was happening at the same time as Bakhmut, which was a very resource-intensive and very tragic battle. If the elite and experienced units were not defending Bakhmut and instead sent to the counteroffensive, I think that could have accomplished something. But that's not what happened. And that was also partially Zaluzhny's call. He is putting, of course, the blame more on the president's office, but he was commander-in-chief. He has responsibility himself. So I'm very skeptical about a lot of what this feud is. As I described in the previous section there, Zaluzhny is an extraordinarily popular figure in Ukraine. People love him. People saw him as an effective commander-in-chief. But I do recognize that he himself was not perfect, and trying to frame this all about Zaluzhny making all the right decisions, but held back by Zelensky, is probably not, especially when he left some stuff out. But ever since then, he has been seen as a potential political rival for Zelensky as, the most popular person in the country. And he has hinted at wanting a political career in the future, but he has been adamant that there cannot be elections right now. Though he did confirm a theory that I had which was that we do know that Zelensky had been approached by the Americans as a way to undermine Zelensky within this last year. Very early on, Trump had identified Zelensky as an obstacle to Trump getting what he wanted in Ukraine, and so the Americans started reaching out to whoever could probably be able to unseat him politically. There were people who very wanted that to be themselves and were not picked. And the person who they did pick, Zelensky, turned the Americans down, meaning that this political crisis that the Americans were trying to engineer never came to pass. But the thing that became a new revelation is that the person who did approach Zelensky for this was Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager, who maintained connections in Ukraine because he is the former campaign manager of the deposed Viktor Yanukovych. Paul Manafort had to be expelled, essentially, from the Trump campaign because he stunk so bad of Russia. He was supposed to be in the political wilderness because he was so tied in to the potential of pinning Russian connections on Trump. A core part of the theory of Trump having these Russia connections comes from the fact that he hired Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort is the Russian trace in the White House, so you'd think they want to keep him at a distance, but no. He's back, still meddling in Ukraine on behalf of America and surely on behalf of Russia. Paul Manafort's still doing his thing, but Zelensky did turn him down. But the fact that good old Paul is still in the employ of Trump, well, that says some things about Russiagate. As Zelensky turns him down, political crisis doesn't happen, but confirmed it was Paul. But overall, he says, again, there cannot be elections. Elections would be illegal, and he does not want to create political splits in the country right now. But the fact that he said these things, the fact that he is so open in his disagreements with Zelensky during all this talk of forcing elections on Ukraine, this was a declaration that Zelensky once again does have political aspirations, but not ones that would jeopardize Ukraine. I don't think he would ever do that. Our next segment will be on the very large outbreak of news about Russian sanctions evasion. As for the intro to this is just to say that there have been rather significant sanctions placed on the Russian economy, both in general and also for specific things. It should theoretically be impossible to difficult for Russia to obtain the equipment it needs to run its defense industry, though that obviously is not the case. Time and time again, American-made electronics are found inside of Russian weapons, including ones that are made after these sanctions went into place. There are various ways that they do this, but the most basic way that they're able to do sanction evasion is to simply reroute any trade through third countries. So an American electronics firm is not shipping to Russia per se, they're shipping to Armenia, or Georgia, or Azerbaijan, or Kyrgyzstan, or any number of other countries that are still within full economic connection with Russia and themselves do not have any sanctions of their own. Rather amazingly, ports into Kyrgyzstan went up many times over in 2022, but I don't believe that if you went to Kyrgyzstan, you'll be able to notice, a quadrupling of their economy. That just doesn't seem very realistic. Or, as is often the case, Russia can just do a purchase on the open market, so it's not necessarily buying things directly from an American supplier, but an American supplier will sell it to a Chinese wholesaler, and then the Russians buy it from the Chinese wholesaler. Not anyone lying, that's just how international trade works, but that is supposed to also be shut off by sanctions. But, none of these sanctions are as airtight as anyone wants you to believe. And that is one reason why it is so hilarious to hear people talking about how, sanctions are there to hurt the average Russian. They can get around them pretty easily. There could be sanctions that are much more strict and could put the hurt to Russia much more, but that could throw off the flow of global capitalism. And we can't have that now, can we? Anyway, so we have 3 stories to share with you right now about various ways that the Russians have gotten around sanctions to bring American and European goods into their country and add to the war economy. The first is out of the Kiev Independent by journalist Alyssa Yurchenko. And how this goes is that in 2026, a Russian drone, a Garan 5, was shot down. The Garan series is largely based off of Iranian designs. They are the Shaheds that we talk about. Often a Shahed is not technically a Shahed, but that's just Iranian designed, but then Russian built. While the Garan 5, as is pointed out in this article, is more akin to just a guided missile, essentially. But when one of these Garans was shot down and its remains were recovered, Ukrainians found that it contained both American and German microchips. Now, Russia does have a large enough defense industry to make big, heavy things. They do not have the best microchip industry, and most of their electronics have relied entirely on import, including from America and Europe. So reading from this article, just to make sure that I do not miss any of the details here. So what was found in the new missile-like drone? Ukrainian intelligence has established that the new drone features a Chinese-made Telefly turbojet engine and a satellite navigation systems receiver. The receiver contains microchips branded with the names of 3 American companies: Texas Instruments, CTS Corporation, and Monolithic Power Systems. Additionally, a microchip bearing the logo of the German company Infineon Technologies was identified in another part of the drone. The largest number of Western microchips found, 6 units, came from the U.S. company Texas Instruments. The Russian arms industry has long relied on its chips. Although manufacturing dates have been established for only 2 of the microchips found in the new Russian drone, they show that the chips don't come from pre-war stockpiles, which means that these microchips were purchased from America after the beginning of the war and after the existence of these sanctions. These 2 chips from the American-based CTS Corporation manufactured in September 2025 and February 2024. And in this case, it does seem to be the second example I gave of how Russia acquires these chips, in that they are bought by Chinese distributors, in this case from the Hong Kong registered microchip suppliers such as Abingo Distributors and Wtron Electronics Technologies, through the Russian company Neoker Trade that does business more broadly in East Asia, especially China. Quite frankly, when it comes to electronics, I don't expect any Western country to be cutting off trade with China or really putting any meaningful limits on what kind of trade can happen with China. Your electronics, a lot of them come from China. I'm sitting here next to my Chinese TV, so what kind of sanction can be put into place is difficult. It certainly can happen. Really comes down to tracking, putting in the due diligence to find out where the product you develop is ending up. But then it will always become a moving target. Say that Hong Kong technologies firm A is blacklisted because it does so much trade with the Russian defense industry, and the call goes out, don't sell to them anymore, it will eventually end up in the hands of Russia. Well, they'll just make another company, or another company will pick up the slack. And so for this case, I just don't have a great answer for how to prevent this. This is in the hands of China, and China has a vested interest in keeping Russia in the war. And frankly, even Ukraine is not exactly super interested in cutting off trade that runs through China. China remains a major trading partner for Ukraine. That's just how the world works. And any sanctions that would be put in place on Chinese companies, on Hong Kong companies that would prevent them from shipping onward to Russia would require very fastidious tracking by trained professionals, and the United States government right now is not interested in that. Last year, the same journalist did an investigation where she attempted to buy American microchips while posing as a Russian defense company. So to read from this other article that she did, the Kiev Independent took on the role of an employee of a real Russell Electronics subsidiary, the Almaz Research and Production Enterprise, which produces electronic systems for military equipment. Surprisingly, the most difficult aspect of the experiment was to create an email account with a Russian email service, as they are blocked in Ukraine. When that was done, trying to buy banned Western chips in Russia was easy. The Kiev Independent prepared a request for a commercial proposal on the behalf of Almaz, asking for circuits produced by American headquartered companies, and sent the request to 24 Russian suppliers of American chips. 10 of them responded, confirming their ability to deliver the required chips. The Russian companies Imotech, AST Components, Elsup, Altec, RTKT, and Veshnex Kasab confirmed they were ready to deliver chips in 1.5 to 3 months. Modern Digital Technologies, Electromir, and Imotech sent their offers. They included chips from Analog Devices, Texas Instruments, and Atmel manufactured in 2022 to 2024. One of the Russian companies, Elaser Group, sent a full list of the chips it currently had in its warehouses indicating the quantity. There were millions of chips of famous American and European brands. So yes, this is all widely available on the Russian market, in many cases due to Chinese resellers. But the next story gets more direct. While it is hard to prevent Chinese resellers from selling onwards to Russia, sometimes American tech companies prefer not to even bother with middlemen and try to sell directly to Russia, as is our next story that was discovered by Hunter Brook Media. And again, just to make sure I don't get any of these details wrong, I'll be reading off their investigation directly. American tech company's networking gear is powering Russian battlefield communications in Ukraine. The company is Ubiquiti, a $35 billion Wi-Fi giant whose founder became the youngest owner of an NBA team in 2012. Hunter Brook's month-long investigation found Ubiquiti wireless bridges, banned from export to Russia under US and EU laws, are widely used by Russian troops, including possibly in drone operations against Ukrainian civilians that the UN has called crimes against humanity. Without Ubiquiti, their Mavics stop working, a Ukrainian drone officer with a call name Django told Hunter Brook, referring to the drones. And there is no adequate alternative to Ubiquiti for the Russian front line. Ukrainian officers and a Russian vendor told Hunter Brook. Devices by competitors like Starlink are remotely disabled or too complex. Ubiquiti products are simple, cheap, and readily available. Ubiquiti networking equipment is so essential to the Russian war effort that vendors selling UI devices sent us letters they said were from the Russian military and supporters thanking them. Radio bridges are necessary to provide wireless connections over long distances and to provide high-quality communication in hard-to-reach areas, one letter said. Another thanked the vendor for critical communication equipment, quote, sent to the combat zone. So we have this established that Ubiquiti knows they are working directly with the Russians to the point where the Russians are sending little thank you love notes. Continues. Hunter Brook found dozens of Russian and social media posts and videos and drone footage showing Ubiquiti antennae mounted at Russian positions. Russian military units or support groups often request or announce the donation of Ubiquiti equipment for the war front on Telegram. Referring to the earlier segment, Telegram is the main tool used to organize between Russian soldiers, and also between Ukrainian soldiers, for that matter. Some of the posters are tied to alleged war crimes. Quote, we thank the People's Militia Assistance Group for providing communications equipment in the form of Ubiquiti antenna, one soldier said in a recent video posted on Telegram. Quote, victory will be ours. To test how easy it would be for the Russian military to get their hands on these devices, Hunter Brook reporter posed as a Russian procurement officer and contacted Russian storefronts openly advertising Ubiquiti items. Many other websites have Ubiquiti in their domain name or have Ubiquiti logos, and some even claim to be official Ubiquiti distributors. Nearly a dozen of them confirmed availability and offered delivery to Russia's warfront in as little as a week. But how are these stores importing these products so easily, despite near total ban after the invasion? To find out, a Hunter Brook reporter posing as a Russian customer also reached out to Ubiquiti's official distributors in countries like Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and even the US. Their response, Ohio-based Multilink Solutions, for one, at first said yes, before clarifying that the product would be shipped to a different country, in this case Turkey, for pickup. 5 others also agreed to ship to an address outside Russia after hearing the ultimate destination was Russia or even the occupied territories in Ukraine. One Georgia reseller said they would ship to Russia directly. Hunter Brook also analyzed publicly available trade data. It showed that after Ubiquiti halted its shipments to Russia in 2022, dozens of exporters in countries like Turkey and Kazakhstan sprang up to take Ubiquiti's place and continue the flow of Ubiquiti shipments to Russia. In fact, the total value of Ubiquiti exports to Russia apparently increased by 66% compared to the same period before the invasion. Hunter Brook's analysis also found out that after the invasion, Ubiquiti's official distributors began shipping Ubiquiti products to companies in countries like Turkey and Kazakhstan, which re-exported Ubiquiti products to the same Russian customers, signs of transshipment tactics that help evade scrutiny. The diversion of banned Ubiquiti equipment to the Russian military is in part a consequence of Ubiquiti's approach to sales. Ubiquiti relies heavily on its official distributors rather than its own sales team to distribute their products. And Ubiquiti openly says it has, quote, no visibility into where its products end up after its distributors sell them. But legal experts say that's not a defensible excuse. U.S. sanctions and export laws operate on strict liability, meaning it doesn't matter if the company knew or intended harm. What does matter is whether Ubiquiti had an adequate compliance system in place, and whether the diversions happened despite Ubiquiti's best efforts, experts told Hunterbrook. But a former employee described Ubiquiti's compliance department as a one-man shop with no automated system to monitor compliance and identify red flags. That's not surprising. With just 1,667 total employees, 31% of the workforce is dedicated to R&D, leaving just 480 employees to staff other departments running Ubiquiti's global sales and operations, including compliance. That's for overseeing $2.6 billion in annual sales and nearly 600 distributors and resellers. And this wouldn't be the first time Ubiquiti got in trouble for export violations. The company was fined by U.S. authorities in 2014 for exports that ended up in Iran, and for its, quote, reckless disregard for compliance obligations that resulted in the violations. Quote, it can't happen again, the company's CEO, James J. Para, said in a 2011 Forbes article. If it does, I'll be in a lot of trouble. Ubiquiti's global distribution network is riddled with compliance red flags beyond Russia. In Paraguay, the founder and president of Flytech Computers, once responsible for 13% of Ubiquiti's revenues, had been accused of smuggling, massive tax evasion, and money laundering in Brazil, and of involvement with the illegal housing of a large-scale Bitcoin mining operation. In Mexico, Ubiquiti's distributor Syscom was quietly acquired in 2011 by Hikvision, a Chinese state-owned company the U.S. designated that same year as part of China's military-industrial complex. Legal experts say Ubiquiti could face civil penalties, export bans, or worse if regulators act. There's also discussion of potential human rights litigation tied to civilian harm enabled by this technology. But the real toll isn't how much Ubiquiti shareholders may have to pay in fines or restitution. It's in the risk to Ukrainian lives, soldiers and civilians alike, killed in a war whose coordination appears to be made possible, in part, by Ubiquiti technology. Alexander Yasenchuk, an activist helping arm Ukraine's defense, had a plea for the American tech giant. I would ask them, if possible, to stop the sale of their technology to Russia. Quote, they must understand, he said, that the company's money carries, quote, the blood of Ukrainians. So yes, that is the two ways in which Russia avoids sanctions. In our first story, it was about buying from Chinese wholesalers, and the second was how these distributors will purchase something in this case, Georgia, Kazakhstan, wherever the case may be, knowing full well that the end location will be Russia, which is all still very much illegal. It doesn't become legal just because someone figures out a clever runaround. This is all part of the sanctions themselves. And if a company knows that these products are going to Russia, that is knowingly taking part in white-collar crime, smuggling, essentially. This last story is shorter, but still, it added to this kind of cacophony of sanction evasion news, and I think it adds to the overall story. Now, this doesn't have to deal necessarily with microchips or even necessarily anything involving Russian industry. Now, this story about Russians using a black market postage service in order to get around sanctions was originally published in the German paper Bild, but that's paywalled, and so I'll be using the Euronews re-report on it instead. So Euronews, Russia uses shadow mail postal system to bypass EU sanctions report reveals. Russia is using a logistics operation in Berlin to circumvent European Union sanctions by routing banned goods to Moscow through a postal system that exploits lighter controls on international mail, according to investigation by German newspaper Bild. Test consignments equipped with GPS transmitters and containing sanctioned goods passed through a logistics hall near Berlin-Brandenburg Airport undisturbed before being forwarded via Poland and Belarus to Moscow, the investigation found. The operation allegedly uses shipping labels from Uzbekistan's state postal service, even though Germany's Federal Network Agency does not authorize the postal service to operate in the country. International mail items face less stringent checks than regular good exports because postal traffic is handled quickly and in large volumes under simplified customs and export procedures. The system is reportedly run by a former managing director of Ruspost GmbH, the German branch of the Russian state postal service, Pochta Rossi, identified by Bild as Dmitry V. Customs authorities searched the company's Berlin offices in August 2024 on suspicion of violating economic sanctions against Russia, but the subsequent investigation produced no results. Ukraine's presidential envoy for sanctions policy, Vladislav Vlasyuk, expressed little surprise at the revelations when asked about them by Euronews in Berlin on Wednesday. Nobody is doing enough if you look at the number of cases, Vlasyuk said when asked whether Germany was doing enough to prevent such loopholes. Ukraine regularly collects information about such practices and shares it with international partners, he said. The principle of systems designed to circumvent Western sanctions is well known to Ukrainian authorities. So in summary, a Russian company operating in Germany uses the lighter controls and regulations on international mail to ship sanctioned goods into Russia because the controls are lighter than they would be in regular import-export. But that last part is really what I find the most relevant here and a nice little summation of this section. These are all very well-known systems. Ukraine knows about them. Ukraine's Western partners know about them. When something new is discovered, Ukraine puts a lot of effort into making sure that our partners know about it. And in this case, there is an investigation, but really, it's a Russian company run by former employees of a Russian state company. Why should that be allowed in the first place? Gee, I wonder why the Russian state postal service is running a logistics company. Wonder whatever they could be doing. I'm sorry, but that has more red flags than a Chinese military parade. Something about it is illegal. Don't allow it to happen in the first place. You know what the score is. You know what they're doing. In all of the cases of the stories I presented in this section, it's known what they're doing. The avenues of sanction evasion into Russia are well marked, well traveled, and have a ton of traffic. Shut down some of the on-ramps. This next story will deal with how Russia treats Ukrainians under occupation, even long after those Ukrainians actually leave occupation. The story comes out of the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group and relates to a Ukrainian named Alexander Kachkurkin, a 25-year-old IT programmer from Crimea. Alexander has apparently been specializing in AI large language models and left Crimea several years ago, largely because of the political persecutions that happened there. And after leaving Crimea, he went to Almaty, Kazakhstan. While in Almaty, was apparently openly pro-Ukrainian and donated to the Ukrainian military. That's in Kazakhstan this is happening, not in Russia. Keep that in mind. However, Russia was able to get the Kazakh authorities to arrest him anyway. Russia claimed that as someone from Crimea, he was therefore a Russian, and that his pro-Ukrainian activities counted as state treason. They gave the request for extradition over to the Kazakh authorities, who agreed to the extradition and shipped him off to Moscow, where he is now facing a sentence of 12 to 20 years on treason charges. Again, he is in Kazakhstan as a Ukrainian citizen, and the Kazakhs hand him over to Russia on accusations that he betrayed Russia. Now, Kazakhstan does not recognize the annexation of Crimea. According to their own logics, none of this is legitimate. However, the Kazakhs also used two different administrative charges that were against him, including, and this is too perfect of a joke, jaywalking, crime that is literally a punchline for something that isn't real and is just there for authorities to harass people with. It is presumed by human rights experts that these administrative charges for jaywalking and allegedly smoking hookah in closed premises, I'm sorry, we all know that is a very common occurrence, not only in Kazakhstan, but many other places. The only reason why these administrative charges happened was because the Kazakh authorities were instructed to find something against him in order to make his case against extradition weaker. A representative of the Russian human rights group Privy Otel, or the First Department, stated that, quote, Kazakhstan is ceasing to be a safe and law-based country, even for Ukrainian citizens. The only way that any of this makes sense is if the Kazakh authorities were instructed by Russia to get rid of a dissident. Now, this is far from an isolated case. Russia is being severe right now, especially in this last year, as I covered in the last episode, by the way, of how strictly they are going after Ukrainians who lived under Russian occupation. But this is a case of not only hunting people down while they're under occupation, but chasing them all the way to Kazakhstan, and the Kazakh government agreeing to go along with it. Now, Kazakhstan is hardly some complete Russian satrapate. It's not Belarus. The relations between Kazakhstan and Russia are, of course, very close, but the Kazakhstan government has frequently taken a stand against being seen as subservient to Moscow. So this isn't like some foregone conclusion that this is how it would turn out, but still, it is how it turned out, and any Ukrainians who happen to be in Kazakhstan have to be on their guard for that. But that said, this kind of behavior is not limited to Russia. I have to say that Ukraine has done this in several cases, mostly relating to Azerbaijan. Ukraine has maintained close relations with Azerbaijan, which is a repressive dictatorship. And there have been cases where Ukraine extradited Azerbaijani citizens back to Baku. So while we very much have to keep on guard for the interests of Ukrainian citizens overseas and which governments may abuse them in the name of their relations with Russia, I do also have to say that Ukraine has to also keep that in mind on its own bilateral relationships with oppressive countries. The last thing I'll talk about this episode is on some developments in the international sphere, none of which I'll dwell on too much, but there have been updates. Regarding Hungary, between now and the election in April, there's going to be a lot of talk about Hungary. I'm going to see if I can maybe go to Hungary? I don't know. That might be in the cards. But the newest update is that the Hungarians are once again doubling down on how much they despise Ukraine and how Ukraine is an enemy, etc., etc. But in this case, it comes down to the Russians had destroyed a piece of the Druzhba pipeline that brings oil from Russia to, among other places, Hungary, which passes through Ukrainian territory. And the Russians damaged a portion of this pipeline, which put a pause on deliveries of Russian oil to Hungary, again, through Ukraine. It's such an absurd situation. And because Ukraine does not immediately repair this and get the oil flowing back into Hungary, Hungary says that this is an attack on Hungarian energy infrastructure by Ukraine rather than by Russia. And so Hungary announces that they will no longer be exporting energy to Ukraine, but then kind of immediately goes back on it because they make money that way is the real answer. But the excuse they gave that allowed them to give that answer was they wanted to still provide electricity to the Hungarian minority in Ukraine, which requires significantly less export than they're saying. It's all nonsense. Slovakia, however, says that they would not export energy either. So we have Robert Fico in Slovakia and Viktor Orban in Hungary, both treating this incident of a Russian attack as instead a Ukrainian one. Then a few days later, Ukraine attacks an oil pumping station all the way in Tatarstan, so half a continent away from Hungary, but because the oil at that pumping station could then theoretically find its way to Hungary, Hungary again says this is an attack on Hungarian sovereignty. You know, this pumping station all the way in Tatarstan. So that's the latest drama with Hungary and to a lesser extent Slovakia. It turns out that energy imports from Slovakia are not so important because the Poles and Czechs immediately said that they would cover any decrease as a result of this. But expect more provocations before the election. And in fact, Hungary has decided to start deploying military assets to both the Ukrainian border and to protect its energy facilities from Ukrainian attack. Though it does not seem like Hungarians are buying this. Some poll I saw in Hungary said that only 5% of Hungarians believe that there could be an attack on Hungary by Ukraine. So it doesn't seem to be working. This absurd populist war pantomime by the Hungarian government does not seem to be working, but they're going to try more and more until what I believe is eventually a setup to declare a state of emergency and maybe cancel elections. So keeping an eye on Hungary is going to be one of the main priorities of this podcast in the coming months. Now, initially, I was going to give some additional commentary on the general state of the world regarding especially Venezuela and Iran. Though, to be completely honest, I kind of already did that last episode. I kind of told myself that I would save it for a more specific episode about it, but really I said most of what needed to be said. Namely, that Russia is incapable of protecting its dependencies, as we saw in Armenia, as we saw in Venezuela, as we saw in Iran, and that technologically, Russian air defenses are entirely a failure when it comes to holding off American driven technology, both used by the United States and Israel. Russia has gone all in on expanding its empire into Ukraine, and in the process, gave up its empire everywhere else. But then, as I'm developing this episode over the course of several days, I am coughing a lot right now. I am editing it out, but it's horrible recording with a cold and a cough. So this is taking a very long time to record. In the process of recording everything, a new bit of breaking news drops in that today Israel resumes its attack on Iran in cooperation with the United States. And this far, it appears to be a redo of the 12-day war, where Israel and the United States are focusing primarily on high-level targets. And they have claimed to have assassinated Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, though there's not full confirmation on that yet. Might be true, might not be true. Where I am at 8 p.m. on February 28th, I do not know. Now, there's a lot to talk about regarding Iran. Iran killed several tens of thousands of protesters recently, though the exact number is certainly unknown. But the official Iranian government numbers, the absolute most undercounted version of it, was 3,000. Up to 30,000. In an event that shown that no, the Iranian government was not crippled. The plan that by striking major Iranian targets, it would allow a revolution to occur, that theory did not pan out, and it bore the cost of blood. We also learned that while the Iranians have lost their proxies in Syria and other places, they very much still had them in Iraq, with Shia Iraqi militias joining in on the repressions. And so if the goal now is to kill a few more top officials and have it work this time around, well, I don't see how repeating the same thing over and again would work. But again, we're still in the first day, and so there's no way to say really what is happening. And Iran has retaliated largely by, well, they did attack Israel as well, but has also retaliated by attacking Qatar, United Arab Emirates, with footage of Iranian drones hitting civilian hotels and other buildings in those countries. While in Iran, in addition to that strike on what maybe could have been Khamenei, something also hit an Iranian school, killing dozens of students. Could have been the Americans, could have been the Israelis, also could have been an Iranian misfire. But again, first day, no real information. And really, the Ukrainians are supportive of this. Iran is a belligerent, hostile country that has directly taken part in aggression against Ukraine. Iranian drones have been one of the main killers of civilians in Ukraine. The Iranians send military observers to the Russian military. Iran is a co-belligerent against Ukraine, and Ukraine is fully correct in treating the Iranian regime as an enemy, because Iran made themselves into an enemy. There's also several other things that Ukrainians have noticed. The United Arab Emirates has more advanced air defense than Ukraine does, yet they are apparently far more vulnerable. The way that these Iranian Shahid and Garan drones work is that they often need to fly in swarms in order to hit anything in Ukraine, because the interception rate on them is in excess of 90%, while they have hit these targets in the Gulf seemingly far more easily than they have hit in Ukraine. Because apparently, no one wants to listen to Ukraine say about anything, including, by the way, the Israeli. There's also a video of a drone hitting an American military base, and I believe it was Bahrain. It's all very fresh, so it could have been Bahrain, it could have been Qatar. I'm not entirely sure on that one, but they have hit both countries. But this military base was apparently empty at the time, so I'm not going to take that as much of an indicator as some other people are. And the other error that I'm seeing some people make is saying that Israel and the United States are destroying these Iranian drones that are headed to Ukraine. Ukraine should be grateful for that, but really it's not 2023 anymore. It's not Iran that is making these drones that are hitting Ukraine. They're mostly built in Russia now. So it's not super relevant in that regard. Though, of course, Iran designed the drones, they're being built in Russia. So this is not directly a benefit to Ukraine in that way. But once again, Russia is doing absolutely nothing about this because they can't, because they put 100% of their chips down on Ukraine. We'll conclude this episode. It was a very difficult one to record. I hope that my voice is not too bad on this. It will require some pretty extensive edits, so it's not just me saying a sentence, coughing, saying the next sentence, coughing. This, of course, threw off my schedule that I really wanted to stick to, so next episode will 100% be the question and answer episode. Get in those questions within the next 2 or 3 days before I record for it. I have plenty to work with right now, but I want more questions, more material. Give me more material to work with. After that, I'll be talking about the Olympics and sport in general. And after that, at some point, the other weird thing that happened today was the launch of Newsmax Ukraine, the far-right MAGA news channel has decided to hook up with some pro-Timoshenko folks here in Ukraine for what they put no good faith in whatsoever, partially because many Newsmax employees are openly pro-Russia and speak out against Ukraine. So I do not like that we're getting a Newsmax Ukraine office, but that will have to go into a future episode when I are able to know more about what the hell's going on with this. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. But of course, if you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype and join our list of supporters. You can also go to our link in the description for a list of resources that you can donate to or get more information from. But I'd like to thank our patrons. So thank you very much to Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, Kyle Smith, Damascus Medusa, Giorgio, David Shepard, Ivana Krakratskaya, Mike, Calvin Alberton, Michael Drucker, PLM, Arminius, Kyle Stark, T. Bart, Barba, Devi, Anonymous, Michael Wickman, Johnny Louise, Marguerite, Dimitri Litvin, Dennis Napalm, Vivek, James Burke, Allison Chainsaw, Big Meg, Elizabeth Hughes, Nick Niazin, Andy S., John Gates, Sanjay, Grace Krause, Laura De Leon, Had to Laugh, Jacob Hoem, Chris Bennington, Livy Grove, James Wise, Alex Crochmal, Ada McDonald, Jerd, Victor Matei, Scott Tokayuk, Etienne Soleil, Anastasia, Captain Technical, Evelyn, Veronica Aim, Julia Lindsay, Emily Bavona, Scott Burry, Anonymous, Subtle Knife, Sandra Bongers, Marianne, RDK, Lori Halila, Christopher Yee, Lemoninkin, Demetrio, Ursula Zolenkoff, Noam Brown, Glowing Wind, Can Dystopian Fiction, Please Remain Fiction, Marcus Nashkis, Andrew Glenn, Zay Perry, William Brown, Abel Lenz, Kabee Valley, Dana Jones, Yellow Duck, Anonymous, Bucktron 2021, Florian Kunkel, Matthew Rowe, Bill, and Tristan Brody. Thank you all very much for your support. You make this all possible. And until next time, Slava Ukraini!